Antony Loewenstein joins me now from Sydney, Australia. He's the author of The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. Always good to see you, Antony. I mean, there's been a plethora of reports out of Gaza recently from the UN-backed groups and others alleging incredibly serious actions by Israel, from starvation to arbitrary detention, unnecessary killing and maiming of children, and worse. I mean, reports have accused Hamas of war crimes as well, we should say. But what is the totality of these reports when it comes to how Israel is prosecuting this war?
Utterly devastating. And the only major party which says that everything is going fine is Israel. Every single leading human rights organisation in the world, the ones you mentioned, everyone in Israel, the human rights organisations within Israel, Palestine, certainly Gaza, are all saying the same thing, which is people are, particularly in the north of Gaza, but also elsewhere, are often starving, malnutrition. There are thousands and thousands of young Palestinian kids, some of whom are dying from starvation. So the idea that we're going to believe the Israeli government, who have a sadly long history of lying about the facts on the ground in Gaza, is absurd. And this is the reality. It is utterly devastating and apocalyptic, where the rate of malnutrition and death is some of the worst we've seen in the last decade. It's just horrific.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about this too, because while Gaza's going on, there's been a lot happening in the West Bank, and not much of it good for Palestinians. The Israeli government announced Sunday that it is going to, quote, strengthen settlements in the occupied West Bank. Didn't define what that means. What do you make of it? Why now? How might that impact the fractured, to say the least, relations with the Palestinians, and for that matter, the outside world for Israel?
I mean, this is essentially, in one level, business as usual, of course, because Israel, definitely before October 7, but certainly since, has been hugely expanding settlements. And essentially, as my Palestinian friends say to me, it's like the Wild West there now. There is no law and order for Palestinians. The rate of death for Palestinian civilians is off the chart. The amount of soldiers, Israeli soldiers and settlers working together to take Palestinian land, ethnically cleanse their territories, off the chart. And ultimately, this really goes to the heart of global impunity. There are still huge amounts of American charities, Australian charities, allowed to give money to settlement building, settlement work. There is no real attempt by the US, by the White House, by any other serious country to stop these funds coming in. And the idea somehow that the West Bank could explode at any one time, there is a real possibility of an explosion. I mean, just in the last few weeks, on one day alone, in May, about 2 weeks ago, 7 young kids were killed in Jenin. That's one day. Civilians were killed. And this is happening day after day after day.
And ongoing settler violence against Palestinian people and property. All of this that we've been discussing raises the issue of Israel's relationship with the United Nations more broadly as an organisation and with its various aid agency. How fraught is that impact? How fraught is that relationship? What's the impact? Where do you see it headed?
Well, it's not good. And essentially what's been happening since October 7, it was already pretty bad before, is that for many UN workers, often foreign workers living in Israel or Palestine, they essentially only get a few months of visas and they have to go back and reapply, and often they're not given visas. I mean, essentially Israel, particularly the far right there, talks about getting rid of the UN entirely. The fact of the matter is, if the UN packed up tomorrow and left in Gaza and the West Bank, there'd be no real humanitarian support in mass. That's the reality. So Israel knows that. So on the one hand, a lot of this is just hot air. On the other hand, the relationship is fracturing because countless UN reports, long before October 7, but certainly since, are documenting, yes, Hamas war crimes, to be sure, but also the massive amounts of Israeli war crimes in Gaza and the West Bank, and the idea that Israel is deliberately starving civilians in Gaza. That is a fact that virtually every human rights organisation is now saying, including the UN.
Before I let you go, I mean, the reality is that, going back to Gaza, that 8 months into this war, it's 9 months really, Hamas leadership is intact. Hamas is on some levels still fighting, has the capability to do that, as we saw with the 8 IDF soldiers killed Saturday. On top of all of that, more than 100 Israeli hostages are still being held. There is no day after plan, which much of the world is demanding. Where does all of that leave Netanyahu and his political position right now?
He hopes that everything can be kicked down the road. And of course, Israel on one level is split between some people who believe in the so-called Greater Israel, which includes obviously settlements in Gaza, but actually beyond that, literally this week there is a conference happening in Israel for people who believe that Greater Israel should include other countries in the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria. Now that might sound crazy to listeners, but that is the vision of many people. Netanyahu, I think, hopes that Trump will win in November, and essentially that he's allowed, therefore, to do even more damage to Palestinians. His aim long-term is to make any Palestinian self-determination impossible, which is why, without outside pressure, sanctions and boycotts, the situation will not change. Because the problem here is not just Netanyahu, it's the fact that the majority of Israeli civilians, based on polling, do not believe in Palestinian self-determination. The problem is the population, not just the political elite there.
Always great.